Okay, and in England, there is a particularly bloody history of royal succession. And again, when we're talking about royal succession, we're talking about the way one king or queen succeeds the former. So in a natural royal succession, the son of the king, the eldest son, would become the next king when the king died, and so on and so forth. And from our point of view today, that perhaps doesn't seem fair or very rational, and perhaps it isn't, but at least it's stable, right? But there are problems that can happen with that kind of a system. For example, what if the king doesn't have a son? Right? So when problems like this pop up, it creates some dispute and some debate about who is the rightful heir to the throne. And these kinds of conflicts and debates plagued England in the centuries before Elizabeth and James. Okay, so for example, we have the 100 Years' War. Again, this is not a history course, but the 100 Years' War results when England's Edward III claims the French throne because there is a lot of intermixing of French and English royal lineage, right? And this is a huge war that causes a lot of financial problems for England, causes a lot of political problems. Many people die, and people in Shakespeare's historical audience, his historical readership, would have remembered the 100 Years' War and really would have been eager to make sure nothing like that happened in their lifetimes. Secondly, we have the War of the Roses. This is a 30-year conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And again, they're fighting over the throne after the death of the king. Whenever we have a question about who's the legitimate heir to the throne, potentially we have a conflict. We have a war. People die. Money's lost. People suffer, right? And naturally, people have a tendency to want to avoid this kind of suffering. And finally, we mentioned Henry VIII. Now, in the case of Henry VIII, it's not about a dispute over who gets to be king, but we can read Henry VIII's behavior as representing anxiety over the stability of the line of succession, because Henry VIII had trouble producing a male heir, right? And when there's no clear male heir to the throne, that creates questions, and it invites political opponents to try to replace the line of succession with someone other than the children of Henry VIII, right? An aspect of English history that's really crucial for us to understand in order for us to make sense of some of the themes and events in Macbeth is the conflict over royal succession. So succession here means who succeeds to the throne. Now, naturally, it's the son of the king who becomes king. But events can happen, such as the failure of the king to produce a son, that can complicate this process. And oftentimes, when this process is complicated, war and suffering ensue. Two examples that we have of war erupting over questions as to who gets to be king are the 100 Years' War and the War of Roses. So the 100 Years' War results when England's Edward III asserts his lineage and his claim to the French throne after the death of Charles IV. It's beyond the scope of our course, but the French monarchy and the English monarchy are very closely related in family history. So sometimes there are disputes about whether there is an English monarch who may have a claim to the throne. And without a son, it's a little bit less clear who gets to be king, right? So in the end, his daughter Elizabeth ends up being one of the most successful monarchs of England. But he had many wives, which was very rare at this time, in part because he wanted to produce a son to make sure that the line of succession is very clear. Okay, so if we can zoom out for a second, English history in particular is fraught with problems about royal succession. So Shakespeare's historical audience would have been a little bit more sensitive to the idea of someone violently usurping or taking over the throne, like Macbeth does in the play. Let's look a little bit more closely at a period called England's Golden Age, a period that we mentioned in our first section when we brought up Elizabethan literature. Then we looked at the literary period of the Elizabethan age. Let's look now at the broader political age of Elizabeth I. So Elizabeth I reigned for 45 years, which is a very long time, until 1603. As we know, after her, James becomes king. Queen Elizabeth reigns over a number of successes for England during this period. One example is the military success of England against the Spanish Armada, which was a naval fleet that posed a threat to England. Another is we see transatlantic trade beginning to flower during the Elizabethan age. This is a boon for the English economy. Elizabeth limits religious persecution. It's not as if people are free to practice whatever religion they want, but relative to previous monarchs, she allows people to enjoy a bit more freedom of religion. Culture blossoms in the English Renaissance. Elizabeth herself, she was a poet. She supported the arts. She supported Shakespeare. So we really see politically, economically, socially, and culturally a period of flourishing in England. And despite all this flourishing, Elizabeth I does produce a little bit of anxiety and fear because Elizabeth never marries and she never has children. So even though she's a very successful monarch and life in England is booming in all of these ways, there's this looming fear of James I. So Elizabeth doesn't produce an heir to the throne because she's never married. So when she dies in 1603, the English Parliament, or governmental body, invites James VI of Scotland, the King of Scotland, to combine the throne of England with the throne of Scotland. And this is kind of odd, right? The idea that such political authority would be handed to the king of a neighboring country. But there are a couple reasons why this happens. One, presumably, this would lead to less conflict and less war than if there was an argument over who deserved to be King of England. And two, James is of the House of Stuart, which is one branch of the English royal. James is considered a descendant of Banquo. Now, modern historians know that this is not true, but in Shakespeare's time, people believed that Banquo was the father of the House of Stuart. Therefore, when the witches say that Banquo is going to produce a line of kings, James I is actually the most recent person in that line of kings. Okay, so it's interesting that James I is in attendance when Macbeth is first performed. James is believed to be a descendant of Banquo. And the prophecy that the witches give is that Banquo will produce a line of kings. So in a sense, if you're in that historical audience, James I is proof that the witches' prophecy is true. First of all, recently there had been a plot to kill the king in England. So in newspapers, in people in their everyday speech, they would have talked about this guy, Guy Fawkes, who was a rebel, and in a plan called the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, he and some other rebels tried to blow up Parliament and kill the king so that they could install a new king, right? So again, this is a clear parallel to Macbeth. And in a sense, Macbeth deals with a historical subject, the 11th century King of Scotland. But in another sense, Macbeth is dealing with current events in England at the time, because there had been plots to kill the king, and there had been questions about who gets to be king. And Macbeth dramatizes all of these different elements that are important for historical Shakespearean society. Macbeth, as we've mentioned many times but can't say it enough, is performed for James in 1606. A couple other things that we want to mention about James. First, James I, before he was King of England, he wrote a book that was very famous. This book was called Demonology, right? The word demonology comes from our modern word, or is related to our modern word demon, which means like a ghoul or like a creature of hell. And the fact that the King of England wrote a book on witches shows us that at the time when Macbeth is staged, it's normal for people to believe in witches. When we read this play, we probably don't believe in witches. We probably think the idea of witches is pretty silly. But when we're reading the play, we suspend our disbelief and we imagine, okay, let's pretend witches exist for the sake of understanding the play. But for Shakespeare's historical audience, they would have actually believed in witches and perhaps found the events that happen in Macbeth to be plausible and realistic. Finally, the key takeaway we want to bring up here is that during the early days of James's reign, people were very much afraid of regicide, which means killing the king, and political disorder. So when Shakespeare writes and stages Macbeth, he is making a play that thematically deals with the kinds of things that people in England at the time were very worried about and very concerned with. So we mentioned in a previous lesson that Shakespeare read about the historical King Macbeth in a text called Holinshed's Chronicles. This is a popular work of history during Shakespeare's day. Shakespeare drew his depiction of the witches in part from King James's Demonology. So these are kind of the two most important texts, right? First we have, right, the Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, right? This is the kind of historical material, which is kind of the source material for the depiction of witches and the supernatural. And Shakespeare is taking these two texts and elements of these two texts and he's weaving them together in a new way when he writes Macbeth. So far we've talked about the historical context of Macbeth. We've talked about the history of English kings and how there were many conflicts over who got to be king. We talked about how Queen Elizabeth I produced a great golden age in England, but that people were very worried who's going to be king after her because she has no husband and no children. And we talked about how James I was invited from Scotland to rule over England, but that there had been plots against his life. And we talked about how James I is the author of a book. Asking ourselves, who holds power in society? This is a really complicated question. We can answer this question in terms of race, in terms of religion, in terms of occupation. But two of the most important ways that people seek to answer these questions today are in terms of class and gender. And gender, in particular, is going to be important for us today when we look at Lady Macbeth, for example, and the extent to which she holds power and is subject to power, and we compare it to the way women ordinarily during Shakespeare's time would have held and been subject to power, we're able to produce some really interesting insights into the meaning and impact of Macbeth. Okay? So let's make sure that we keep this in mind. When we get to lesson 12, we're going to spend part of that lesson focusing on gender and Macbeth, but throughout our analysis, we're going to be commenting on Lady Macbeth and the witches, and even Lady Macduff as female characters in the world of Macbeth, and how they hold and are subject to power. I think sometimes when high school students, such as yourselves, are first learning to analyze social context in literature, they're a little bit confused about what it means to analyze social context. And when you bring up something like power, again, maybe it can be a little bit confusing to understand how the rules of society show power relationships. But I think one contemporary example that could help us understand is drinking culture, if you'll give me a second to explain. So sometimes social power operates in ways that are almost invisible. In other words, they happen all the time and they seem so unimportant that we don't even notice them. But if we imagine a scenario where colleagues are out together with their boss having dinner and having some drinks, there are certain rules that clearly show who holds power in that situation. For example, in many cultures, if you're drinking with a boss, you need to be really sure to refill the boss's glass, right? In some cultures, the boss should never have to pour his or her own drink, but rather people will have to be quick to fill their drink for him or her as a sign of respect. Another example is, so if two people are raising a toast here, it's important that the boss's glass stays above the other person's glass. And again, this seems like something not very important. It's something we might not even notice. We just think of it as good manners. But when we analyze all these different social rules that seem invisible to us, what do we end up with? We end up with a clear indication of who holds power. So similarly, when we're looking at a scene from Macbeth or a scene from a literary work, we want to look at the little subtle behavior of different people, different words they use, right? Different gestures that they make. And this is going to give us a clue as to who holds power and what that means socially in the world of the literary text.